Welcome everyone. My name is Christine Mercer and I am the Queensland State and Legal Manager at Lex Medicus. Before we start, we would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's complimentary CPD masterclass on mandatory vaccines in the workplace. This topical and controversial subject will be discussed by 4 top experts in their field, who together offer a wealth of experience in the legal and medical industries, especially regarding COVID. Before I hand over to the experts to introduce themselves, I'd like to strongly encourage you to all make the most of this opportunity to ask this esteemed panel all your burning mandatory vaccine questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to those who pre-submitted questions. We will ensure that these will be addressed at the end. If you are a legal professional attending this session, you will receive a CPD certificate by email before the end of the day. Without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Justin Denholm. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks everybody for coming in today. Really excited to be here and to have a chat to you about this really important and topical issue. By way of background to some of where I'm coming from, I'm an infectious diseases physician based primarily at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and at the University of Melbourne, particularly at the Doherty Institute, where I work in a range of infectious diseases. But over the last 18 months, of course, I've been doing more COVID than anything else. At the moment, I'm working directly on what we call the hot wards at Royal Melbourne. So I've been over there this morning to see patients with COVID. Right now, we have just under 100 people admitted to hospital, which is across 7 dedicated COVID wards that would otherwise have been working as surgical wards or medical wards or doing a range of other functions, but have been repurposed to be set aside just for COVID activity at the moment. And that includes about half of our intensive care unit. There's some big differences I see between that work that I've been doing this week and over the last couple of months, and compared to what we think of as our first big hospital wave in 2020. The main difference being that last year we saw primarily infections in older people, a lot of nursing homes with outbreaks. This year, quite different, particularly because of the way that the vaccination program in the elderly has been focused. And so most of the people that I'm looking after, similar to last year, are still not vaccinated, but primarily it's people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who haven't been vaccinated who are in my wards at the moment. So I've got lots of reasons why I want to see people vaccinated and can see the impact in my everyday work. But as an ethicist and someone working in public health, I'm a little bit ambivalent about mandates, and I much prefer to be able to have good conversations with people about their risk and the benefit of that at an individual level. So I'm really interested in this conversation today and to hearing from the rest of the panelists, particularly about how those issues intersect with a range of legal and employment aspects as they come together. So thanks for having me as part of the conversation. Chris, I think I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Justin. My name's Dr. Christopher Edwards. I'm from International SOS, which is a health and security advice firm, global, and we look after ASX 200 clients locally as well as Fortune 500 companies around the world. Obviously, a lot of my work has been around COVID of late. My background is an emergency physician, and a lot of our work is really risk management, which really dovetails well into how employers are needing to manage COVID in the workplace moving forward, because it is all about balancing the risks and benefits of various measures. The things that I've been involved in are too numerous to mention, but things like creation of vaccination policies, looking at structural setups of offices, vaccine hesitancy webinars, just going through the evidence, because there is, I really feel for people because there's so much information out there coming from all different sources. It's really, really hard, even as a trained doctor, it's hard to find the appropriate evidence and the reliable evidence and interpret it. For the layperson, it must be extremely difficult. So I spend a lot of my time trying to help people understand what's going on and all the changing data that comes with that. Really, for employers who are asking about vaccination policy, I simply say that the government is doing a lot of the stick approach. And I encourage employers to work on the carrot approach. You attract more bees with honey. It's a really good idea to try and incentivize, remove barriers to help people get vaccinated to provide protection in the workplace before moving on to discussions about mandatory vaccination. And whether or not that's appropriate, it does depend entirely on the employer, the industry, and whether or not they have legal setup for that in regards to any sort of workers who are required to have a public health order for vaccination, things like that. So we assist companies working through those complicated processes with medical input and in discussion with their legal and HR teams. I'll hand over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Look, once again, I'd like to say thank you to Lex Medicus for setting up this webinar. I'm a bit outside my comfort zone with so many legal practitioners here, and I'm just a humble clinician. So I've been working in adult intensive care as a specialist for the last 30 years. And part of that role, or in addition to that, I've also, like Chris, I've done some international aeromedical retrieval, which has been useful for exposing me to other healthcare systems. In addition, since 2015, I've been part of the WHO Pandemic Preparedness Program. This pandemic was predicted. It was really just a matter of where and when it was going to appear. So WHO has been very proactive in trying to prepare low-income countries for such an event. Ironically, it seems that we perhaps could have saved more lives if we'd undertaken our educational activities in high-income countries, where a substantial amount of the mortality has actually occurred. So early in January and February of last year, when this first became into the public sphere, I was seconded to Geneva to assist in their initial response. Those were very hectic days, as you could imagine. And at that stage, it was really, as I said, everyone had been preparing for it, but it still was quite difficult to coordinate activities at such short notice. I'd just like to put in a little plug for the WHO. I think they do a fantastic job. A lot of it is done voluntarily, and they rely on high-income countries such as Australia to keep the system running. And in addition, then I've been working with Lex Medicus as one of their consultants for several years. I, of course, like my colleagues, have been involved in the care of these patients, particularly those who are critically ill in intensive care. And look, it certainly has been a challenge to the system. But overall, when you look at the mortality rate per million of population in Australia, despite all our problems, we have done incredibly well. Incredibly well. And I think we need to keep that in mind. Thank you. I'll pass on now to, I'm not certain who's next, sorry.
That would be me, Paul. My name is Paul O'Halloran. I'm an employment partner at Colin, Biggers and Paisley Lawyers. And for the past 15 months have been dealing with COVID-related legal questions every day, really. And employers in particular, I think there's a real point of confusion around the medical interface with workplace policies, whether mandatory vaccination is necessary in all industries and all workplaces, and what to do with employees that refuse the mandatory vaccination. So it's been said that this is potentially the busiest period in decades for employment lawyers. And we are moving into a space now where employees are starting to be dismissed by employers for refusing vaccination. So this is a really interesting topic that combines both legal and medical issues, and we have a range of questions for the panel that you have all submitted that we might get to now. So there is a Q&A box in the screen. So viewers, listeners, feel free to type your question and send it through as we talk. But I'm now going to pose some questions to our panel that we've received in advance. So Chris, I might initially pose the first question to you. The key reason for vaccinations to occur in the workplace is to keep people from getting sick with COVID, but we keep hearing about the stress on hospital capacity. What are the causes of that stress? And if it's an underlying staffing issue, why do these understaffing issues exist?
A good question. The public health system in Australia is an excellent public health system, one of the best in the world. But unfortunately, it's suffered from underfunding or a lack of rise in funding as people present and as demand rises. We see that most of our hospitals run at least 90%, if not close to 100% capacity on most days. So now we suddenly have a surge in demand due to COVID. And as a result, what we're seeing is that our health resources are struggling to cope. And there's multiple reasons for that. Funding is one thing, and as a result, staffing. Hospital beds is another one, the limitation in hospital beds running at close to capacity. And then, of course, the politics of it as well, with funding and health in Australia split between federal and state responsibilities, which leads to, I guess, sometimes a strategic conflict between, the management of things in the primary healthcare setting and the hospital setting, and shifts that happen from that. In regards to what's happening at the coalface, I might ask Justin and Paul to comment on that.
Sure. Look, I guess on a human level, it's worth adding that we certainly are seeing a lot of shifts within the hospital and attempts to create additional resources to deal with surges. And maybe just to put some practical spin on it. So right now, I'm one of the consultants covering the COVID ward. Of course, before COVID, I had a different day job, which didn't involve sitting around waiting for COVID to come. I'm the medical director of Victoria's tuberculosis program. And so that means that as well as rearranging that workplace in the same way that all of you have done, doing work that's based by Zoom and all of these kinds of things to keep that regular day job running, I've had to be redeployed from one thing to another because, myself and my colleagues were people who've had 20 years or so of training in infectious diseases and the various aspects that come to it. And so redeploying us from one thing to another does leave gaps in the things that we get moved from. Some of those things are physical. There are there's some extent to which our COVID wards are using up beds that would be filled by people having elective surgery, for example. But the biggest impacts and the biggest difficulties in changing are around staff and the need for experienced staff that just can't be changed on a day-to-day basis.
And Paul, you work in intensive care. Is that a situation you've seen play out in that environment?
Well, I'd just like to mirror those comments that the main limitation on service delivery is the correctly trained staff. And that is something that it is very hard to suddenly, with a magic wand, replace staff at short notice. We've had problems with large numbers of staff having to go on furlough because of unexpected exposure. In addition, Australia imports a large number of healthcare staff each year, and that source has dried up dramatically. That's particularly in the case of nursing staff. And so that's posed a limitation. The systems have tried to adapt to that. For instance, I know here in Victoria, with this latest outbreak, the state government has allocated streaming hospitals who will preferentially treat patients with COVID. And that has allowed the state to spread the patients around so that no one hospital is likely to become overwhelmed. Because as we can all see, this happens very regionally. So suddenly there'll be an outbreak in Western Sydney and all the hospitals there will start to become very full. So that's one way of dealing with it, by spreading it around. The other thing that has helped dramatically, of course, has been the vaccination rates. And so the dire predictions that were made even 6 months ago, fortunately, have not come to be shown to be true, which is tremendous. The healthcare system hasn't been overwhelmed. Numbers are declining. I've just got the figures, say, for instance, in Victoria today, 657 cases in hospital with COVID and only 117 cases in ICU. So that's well within the capacity of the system to deal with. I don't think we're likely to see another major surge because of the vaccination rates. So by good luck or by good planning, we have managed to avoid the catastrophic scenarios that we saw playing out in Europe, in North America last year. So I also echo the comments that the healthcare system, unfortunately, runs at near maximum all of the time. And even small increases in numbers are difficult to cope with. But as I said, by good luck or good planning, we have managed to do so. Thank you.
Well, just on that, Paul, given the vaccinated population in Victoria is expected to be around 90% by December, and a question for Justin as well, what kind of risk does the unvaccinated population pose to the greater vaccinated population by continuing not to be vaccinated?
So of those who are eligible to be vaccinated, the people who are not vaccinated are largely those who voluntarily choose not to be vaccinated. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny number of people who may not be able to complete their vaccination because of allergic reactions to initial doses. But there's also a number of people in our community who, for whatever reason, even if they are vaccinated, they do not achieve a good immune response to that. So patients who are on various immunosuppressive medications, for instance, even if they are vaccinated, they may not achieve the same level of security and protection that a healthy person would. So the whole concept of herd immunity is partly directed at that. If we have sufficient numbers of the healthy population vaccinated, then the risk of an outbreak and the extent of that outbreak can greatly ameliorate the risk to those patients who do not have a good immune response. The people who choose not to be vaccinated, even though there's no medical reason for them not to do so, add to the risk to themselves and to the wider community, because they may allow circulation of the virus. The longer the virus circulates, the more likely we are to develop new strains, which may then get around some of the vaccination protection. So those patients or those people are presenting a risk to themselves, to the immunocompromised in our community, and to those of us who have been vaccinated. Now, that's of those who are eligible. There's still a significant proportion of the population that is children who are not yet eligible to be vaccinated. But we do hope that very soon we will have approval for vaccination in children. So we will remove that pool in which the virus may circulate. The other area of unvaccinated people that we do need to address is the remainder of the world. We have seen that this is a global pandemic. If we do not assist in vaccinating the world, then it is very likely that variants will come back and reinfect us. So it is in our best interest to ensure that as many people in the world as possible are vaccinated. And I think that has to be part of our strategy. Thank you.
Justin, any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I'll echo that, but maybe one or two other things to add in the mix. I guess because you've asked particularly about the risk from unvaccinated people into the larger population, just a couple of things there that might be helpful. The first is that whenever we use numbers like 90% or thresholds, you know, we're not going to be talking about a number that is uniformly distributed amongst the community. So even leaving aside the very important issue of children and people who are not eligible, we know that there will be certain groups of people in society who are more likely to be not vaccinated. Now, predominantly through both the Victorian and the New South Wales outbreaks, early on, we've seen very low rates of vaccination amongst culturally diverse populations, particularly those who have less access to healthcare, primary care, and less access to language-specific services. So those have been really important things for public health outreach to try to correct and improve the access there. As we move forward in the pandemic, and fortunately many of those issues are rapidly being corrected, we're also seeing more deliberate vaccine refusal, and that does tend to cluster because of course people like to spend time with people who share their views and beliefs. And so it does mean that there will be some communities more at risk, like my local community of Brunswick, which is lagging behind for probably some of the latter reasons. So that's also important as to how these infections spread throughout the system. And so dealing with those access issues in Australia as well as globally will be really critical for us.
And I think that's where employers have an important role. I mean, the percentage of people who I call the never vaxxers who have made their decision not to vaccinate, and it doesn't matter what you say, you can't change it, is very, very small. Of the people who haven't yet received a vaccination by choice, most of them are just, the term is vaccine hesitant. And given how much information has out there and how much it changes, I don't blame them. I think it's a perfectly natural response. But with education, with explanation, with communication, you can often help address those concerns. And that's where I think employers really need to, and that's what I do, is a lot of my work is giving webinars on vaccine hesitancy and explaining the data, and then also, you know, pointing them in the direction of reliable sources to look up. So I think that's a really important thing to note, is that, you know, the never vaxxers are a very small proportion of the unvaccinated. In fact, most people just aren't sure, don't know, and I don't blame them. But I think the employers have a key role in communicating through, you know, health experts, getting advice and communicating all that information and the risk, and having a frank discussion, or their GP.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think from my perspective, from a legal perspective, most of the employees, actually almost all of them, just from recollection, that are refusing vaccination, it's out of hesitancy, out of fear. We see very few legitimate contraindications. So I guess on that point, one of our listeners has asked, in certain circumstances, employees have a right not to attend a workplace if they have a reasonable belief that there are serious and imminent dangers to their health. How does this bear on the current easing of restrictions? Well, I think from my perspective, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, employees are entitled to be paid where they cease work based on a reasonable concern for their health and safety in the workplace. But the question is the concern likely to be reasonable when the majority of the workforce is probably going to be vaccinated, that there'll be social distancing, adequate ventilation in most workplaces? It's pretty unlikely that that section of the Occupational Health and Safety Act here in Victoria would be invoked. The famous case involving Esso gas plant, where employees refused to attend work because there was a concern that noxious gases were escaping in the workplace, and essentially there was a risk of explosion. So I think it's a very different situation with COVID. if I could ask Chris, Justin, or Paul, what are the risks of attending the workplace if there are unvaccinated people there? What do you see as the key risks? Ventilation keeps coming up as an issue in professional services. What have you got to say about those particular risks?
I'll let Justin go before me. I'll finish up the response to that one with the employers.
That's good. You can pick up all the things that I missed, Chris. Look, without pretending to be an occupational health and safety expert, I guess some of the principles that I look for, and when I'm coming into workplaces around the healthcare sector, or when I'm having conversations with businesses, social groups operating in different environments, I'm really interested in a holistic assessment of what the genuine risk is to individuals entering that. And when I think about risk, I think about it in two levels. The first is about the likelihood that an individual person will be exposed to COVID. And the second thing is, if that person was exposed to COVID, what's the likelihood that they would develop a significant complication of that? And those two things are separate. So we can have, for example, somebody who is pregnant. Now that person is no more likely to be exposed to COVID in a workplace. However, if they were exposed, they're more likely to get a serious complication of it. And so there are different strategies that may be helpful to mitigate different elements of that. As a basic expectation, you've mentioned really important things like ventilation already. Sometimes there's a lot of focus on masks, and we can talk more about masks, which can certainly be valuable in different ways. But for me, when I come to thinking about how to prioritize something like mask use, masks are there as one line of defense, and I'm much more interested to think first about how we can optimize other conditions, particularly ventilation, to provide the best environment from the outset. So it's a range of different factors, and certainly we'll keep coming back to vaccination because again, vaccination for those staff who are most likely to get significant complications becomes increasingly more important as far as mitigating the impact of a potential exposure. So there's a lot of general things a lot more things we could say about that. Those are some of the principles that I start to work through.
And I guess employers are, most employers are doing the right thing and trying to make the workplace as safe as possible. And it is, again, I keep coming back to this concept of risk management. That is exactly what it is. Will the risk ever be 0%? No. Unrealistic. Death and taxes are the only 100% in life. But what employers can do, so you mentioned ventilation, and I'm not a HVAC expert, but there's actually the WHO have provided WHO have provided an excellent roadmap about ensuring good practice in regards to indoor ventilation for businesses, residential areas, and hospitals, and I use that as a starter because it's actually, for a non-HVAC expert like myself, it's actually really easy to understand. So that's something that talks about making sure that you keep a ventilation rate of at least 10 litres per second per person. So therefore, you've got to think about, how does your ventilation work? Do you need to open windows if that's necessary? Limiting the people in the area. Obviously, if it's a per person ratio, then you should be considering density measures as well, or maximum room occupancies, and operating these devices outside of their norm, I guess. So making sure they don't recirculate air, making sure that after work's finished, that it does a complete cycle of getting all the air inside, outside. So that's certainly something with ventilation. And in regards to office redesign, that's huge. But, moving away from hot desking, cleaning protocols after use, timed or staggered staggered shift times. So if you stagger your shift times, so starting work, you stagger the amount of people coming in at any one time. You also reduce their risk with their commute to work, and particularly if they don't have to go during peak time. And of course, there's the hybrid strategy, which depends on the employer whether it works, but some work from home, some coming to work in the workplace. So there's all sorts of strategies in place, and it does highly depend on the type of employer and the type of industry. But I think it's safe to say that most employers are keenly aware of reducing the risk to employees with coming into work.
Definitely. Paul, if I could pose a question to you, looking at Europe that's currently struggling entering winter, an increase in COVID infections, an open economy, elective surgery going ahead. Is Australia's hospital system ready for this? And what can be done from a national and employers level to prepare in the best possible way?
That's Paul, me.
Paul McGinn, yep.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kate. Thank you. Yeah, look, there has been an upsurge with the relaxation of the restrictions in Europe. And what we can partly attribute that to is the fact that they have a lower vaccination rate, many countries now, than Australia. Australia's vaccination rates are now really quite something to be proud of. And I think it's likely, if you look at the first vaccination rates, that implies that people will go on to have the second vaccination. And those first vaccination rates are 90% and higher. So it is likely that we will achieve a very high vaccination rate, certainly higher than what has been seen in Europe. In addition, there's the seasonal effect that we know now is quite strong with this disease. And it's perhaps not surprising that they've timed the relaxation of their restrictions has not been the optimal time. For us, of course, coming into summer and with higher vaccination rates and looking at the numbers that we're seeing in Victoria and to a lesser extent in New South Wales, which are the states that are having these significant outbreaks at the moment, both of those outbreaks are coming under control. And looking at how many vaccinations people will continue to have over the next until the end of the year, I think we'd be pretty confident that our healthcare system is very unlikely to be overwhelmed at this stage. New variants, of course, may throw a different light on that. And so once again, that's one reason why the sooner we have as many people vaccinated as possible, the better. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Looking at the questions coming through, I think realistically, we probably need 10 hours to get through all of these. So what I might do is just quickly go through a couple and then pose some more specific ones to each of you, Justin, Chris, and Paul. One of our viewers asks if an employer says that a worker must be vaccinated to keep their employment, but they state they're required to return to the office after they've worked successfully from home for the past year, can the employee fight an unfair dismissal on the grounds that they should continue to be able to work from home and that a return requirement with dismissal from no vaccination is unfair? Well, we're sort of really yet to see. Lawyers base their advice on case precedent, and we've had some precedent relating to the flu vaccines, but none relating to COVID just at the moment. I think it's important to remember, though, that whilst the unfair dismissal regime gives employers a valid reason to terminate a person's employment, what must be taken into account is broader than that. You can have a valid reason, but the dismissal may still be harsh, unjust, or unreasonable. So you need to take into account whether the person can be redeployed, whether they can work from home successfully, their length of service, all those sorts of things. So a valid reason, non-compliance with a lawful and reasonable direction to be vaccinated, may not necessarily be enough to win an unfair dismissal. So good question. And I guess time will tell exactly how that will play out. We have another viewer that says, I'm a criminal lawyer. Many of my clients are hesitant to be vaccinated. Unsurprisingly, most of them have little formal education and are skeptical of authority. How would you communicate the importance of getting vaccinated to such a group? Any views from the panel?
With honesty is probably the first phrase I'd say. Recognizing that vaccination is not perfect, particularly against Delta. It's not as effective getting the virus, but really emphasizing how effective all of the approved vaccines in Australia at preventing hospitalisation and severe disease. So an honest communication with people, realising, not trying to blow smoke, as the phrase is, but really just trying to have an honest conversation with them, asking what their concerns are. And then the other thing I do is my response is usually to also talk to them about how to find information, because there's so much out there. It's really easy to get stuck down the dark corners of the internet and find all sorts of conspiracy theory, which sometimes it's just misinformation. It's just people have interpreted correctly. And sometimes it's disinformation, which is where someone has taken something from the science and twisted it to argue their point, which the science doesn't support. And the classic example is, cases are going up despite vaccination. And I explain it's because of Delta and its transmissibility. It's not because the vaccine completely failed or anything. It's just Delta's worse. But anyway, I think education regards, a respectful conversation, understanding the concerns and appreciating that so much information out there, it's hard. And then I usually point them towards various sources of information, sometimes government and sometimes not, because some people don't want to listen to what the government's saying, but independent journalist websites. So theconversation.com, AAP, the Australian Associated Press, are both excellent examples of independent journalistic sites where you can look at this information. They go through a lot of fact busting.
Justin, from an ethical perspective, you've done some writing in this area. There seems to be a lot of fear and distrust directed to people infected with COVID and the risks they may pose to others in the workplace. You've said that every person who is sick was infected by someone else, and we're yet to see COVID transmitted maliciously or deliberately. Do you think employers need to be a little bit more open-minded or pastoral rather than punitive in the way they mandate vaccinations in the workplace? Are mandatory vaccination policies aimed at punishing people for having or spreading the virus?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Paul. Thanks for asking it. Look, I think that, honestly, I feel sorry for business owners and employers in a lot of this for a few reasons. So the reality is that none of us exist on our own. We don't get to have these conversations just in a microcosm. They're having them they're having conversations in a world where newspapers put people on the front page and blame and shame them, where a lot of the language around mandates is directed at perceived risk to others and isolation. There's a lot of stigma associated with this. And that means that there's a lot of trauma for people around questions of whether to get vaccinated or not, just as there are around the experience of getting COVID and the guilt and shame that can come along with the feelings that are put on them. So there's difficult contexts for employers to be having those conversations. And the reality is that many people are not that well equipped to have these conversations as well too, right? Like there's a variety of different factors that are putting pressure on employers in having that as well too. And so, as Chris has already said, looking for opportunities to point people towards independent ways that they can be supported is really helpful. There's also some things that I think we can do to better support people through their vaccination journey, if I can say that. And one of the key things for me is there's so much focus on the question of will you get vaccinated, that can be a real roadblock for people. And mandates don't help there because they put time pressure on that decision as well too. So for me, the big focus in having those conversations is to listen. It's to hear people about the specifics of their situation, the questions that they have. Yes, to offer information where it's useful and it's wanted. But for me, one of the big paradigm shifts is I like to try at some point in that conversation to have a conversation, to talk about not the question of will you get vaccinated, but if you were to be vaccinated, how would that be most resonant for you? How would that work for you? And that's a really interesting thought experiment for people. And that's led me to some things that are really tailored to individuals. So for some people, I have helped them to think about what sort of what sort of vitamin supplements might they take to help them feel that they're prepared for a vaccine? Last week, I sat with somebody to help them think about some guided meditation that they could do around the experience of having the vaccine themselves. So I want to frame the question about what's a way that would make sense to you in your life that you can get this vaccine, rather than just how do you deal with the fact that someone else is making you feel like you have to have it. So I think there are some shifts that we can do there, but they're not easy for employers to do when they're in that that conflicted and multi-level sort of context.
Yeah, good answer. And I think it's difficult when government directions come out with very little notice and there are very strict requirements around what must be done. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for employers. And it's important to note that the government directions do not say that you can dismiss somebody for not having the vaccination. They merely say the person in Victoria can't attend the premises. So whether there's grounds for dismissal is a whole separate issue, really. One of our viewers is asking, seems to be a common topic. Staff are currently refusing to be vaccinated. We have requested that they go on leave without pay for the time being. Would this open stress claims as they are not able to attend work? That's probably considered under workers' compensation legislation to be reasonable management action carried out in a reasonable manner. If there's a public health order requiring vaccination, case law does support the no work, no pay concept. So somebody stood down without pay would be lawful. Provided that was done in a reasonable manner, that may be a basis to decline a workers' compensation claim that employer may bring for stress. Such claims need only relate to the course of the employment. So we're yet to see some of these come through, but I expect there's a few on the horizon. Paul McGinn, if I could ask you just to reflect on this term that we're all hearing about, that's probably very common to medical professionals, but not the rest of us, medical contraindications. Employers are receiving medical certificates from GPs saying that the patient has a medical contraindication, but not providing really anything more specific than that. If it's possible to say briefly, what is a medical contraindication and what sort of medical evidence is satisfactory to establish that?
Mm-hmm. There are very few medical contraindications to having these vaccines. None of them pose a risk of developing the infection. So in the past, we've had live attenuated vaccines. These aren't that. These are either completely inactivated viruses or components of viruses. So we don't have to worry about that. In general, the rare complications that have occurred are allergy type reactions, and they are to some of the components, the additional components that are contained in the vaccines. So you don't know that you have a contraindication to it until you have the vaccine. So it's on the first dose where you might suffer an allergic type reaction, where you may then be you may decline to take the second dose of that vaccine. So in general, I'm happy to defer to Justin on this, but in general, there's no contraindication to the first dose that I'm particularly aware of in terms of health and safety of the person. Justin, are you aware of any?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a couple, but again, very, very rare. I mean, so for example, we've heard about concerns with some myocarditis with the Pfizer vaccine. So it's possible, for example, that someone might have pre-existing very severe heart failure and be assessed by a cardiologist and consider that small risk to be significant enough that it contraindicates them. So there are some, but they're very small print, as Paul is saying. These quite right that almost all of these do fall into a vaccine reaction category. There is a defined list of these conditions which has been supported by ATAGI and is now listed on the Australian Immunisation Register. So certain categories of physicians have to sign off on this. So GPs, infectious diseases physicians, I filled out one this morning because as well as the permanent exemptions that we're mostly talking about, there are also some temporary exemptions that allow people to have periods of up to 6 months without vaccination. Again, these are pretty limited, and in my personal experience, they're mostly about people who've actually had COVID and have a period of exemption until they get vaccinated after recovering from their COVID infection.
And hopefully this happens in the future, but there was some talk, I believe, from the government some time ago about the introduction of exemption certificates. So like the vaccination certificates that we currently have, the digital certificates, the ability that once you fulfill the ATAGI guidelines, which are strict and quite limited, if you fulfill that, whether it's a temporary, which is usually recommended no longer than 6 months, or complete exemption, that you get a certificate so that you can show that, just like you would your COVID certificate that says I'm not vaccinated, but it's a good reason why. So that would hopefully, if that comes about, that'll certainly make things easier for employers and employees alike.
Now, somebody's asking if an employee has an adverse reaction following their dose of the vaccine, because it was required by the employer, can they take sick leave? Yes, I think that's pretty uncontroversial. That would be an absence based on an illness from the vaccine. But whether it gives rise to workers' compensation, I guess, is another question.
The government actually has a no fault cover for, can't remember the absolute value, but it's if costs incurred above X amount, then there's a no fault coverage guaranteed by the government that can be used for people who suffer severe adverse effects from vaccination. So that's another level of support that it's not as well known as it should be.
Yes. Chris, in terms of enhanced workplace safety, rapid antigen testing is becoming available this month for employers to use, I believe. How effective is that, do you know? And would you encourage uptake of that as an additional safety measure?
So that is the latest thing that I'm looking at. This has become quite the topical discussion, given that what's happened now is TGA has approved currently 12, as of my check this morning, 12 home tests that can be used by the layperson at home. Previously, rapid antigen testing had to be done under the supervision of a health professional, and that created a lot of logistical, financial issues for employers. Now, with the advent of the ability to access home antigen testing, that certainly makes the concept a little easier for employers, and maybe something moving forward. How useful is it? It's a tailored response. It depends how many people you have, what sort of industry you have. Are you at high risk setting? What we know is that they're not perfect. If they were, we'd be using that instead of PCR. But they're not perfect. And one of their main things is, what you don't want to miss someone who is positive with COVID and it says negative, because then they come to work and they spread it all around, and there's your problem. Now, there are certain ways to overcome that. First of all is that you use it in higher risk settings. Those tests become more effective if you've got an outbreak. Now, we don't have big outbreaks in Australia. Most of ours have been pretty mild compared to the rest of the world. So that's an issue. But certainly in high risk scenarios, there is more benefit to using them. Higher risk mitigation makes sense. The other thing, and this is where will be interesting to see what the state governments are going to say about what they require with home antigen testing. But certainly the current evidence suggests that if you want to increase the chance of picking up someone who is COVID, picking them up COVID positive and picking them up early, not symptomatic, because you can't use these for symptomatic testing. That is PCR. This is for asymptomatic testing only. The solution to that, in part, is to test people 3 times per week. That's the recommendation. And that's certainly what the Victorian government has recommended at this stage. So it's something I'm spending a lot of time with clients discussing, because it's a nuanced response that depends on their situation. But certainly caveats are, it's not perfect, but you can increase the testing. And the other thing is, and this is something that's forgotten about, is it is not a replacement. It's not a replacement for doing the things you should be doing in a COVID-safe workplace. Masks, distancing, hand hygiene, staying away from work if you've got symptoms. It does not replace that. It doesn't make you Superman and you can go around and cough on everyone. So those are the things we're really talking with clients about is yes, it's a promising new thing moving forward, certainly based on studies overseas, but there are caveats.
Interesting. Justin, a question for you. Do masks actually do anything to stop the spread of COVID, and to what degree?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of that. So look, the big picture is that this kind of makes sense in one level, right? I mean, we're talking about a condition that is in the lungs and is breathed out, and so something that gets in the way, that seems very useful. And absolutely, masks have a big role to play. The question is about how do we use these things in a way which is intelligent and contextualized? So the largest study of masks around the world was conducted in Bangladesh earlier this year and late last year. And as a kind of big picture number, what they tried to do was they tried to get everybody in communities wearing masks. And they found that in villages that were using masks outside of the home, there was a reduction of about 10 to 11% of community transmission. Okay, so for that sort of broad-based event, that's that's not perfect, but it's not negligible either when you're thinking about how you blunt a response. Down the other end of the spectrum, if I'm thinking about the sort of masking practices that I want going into a poorly ventilated room with someone who's known to have COVID, as was the situation, unfortunately, for a period of time in aged care last year, that's a sort of situation where you're relying very heavily on your respiratory protection, and even that will probably be imperfect. So absolutely, masks have a role. Good masks, particularly N95 masks that are fit tested and fit checked, that we know are tailored to people's faces and can be used in an appropriate condition under appropriate training and supervision, can be very effective. And so, I'm in a situation where I work in a big organization that is seeing many people who we know have COVID in confined spaces every day. And we've had no staff infections this year because of following those kinds of things in a conjunction with all of the ventilation practices that we talked about before. So this is part of a package deal. Masks absolutely have a place, but that doesn't mean we need to have blanket rules that says you have to wear a mask while you're swimming or riding your bike on a track cycle, that kind of thing.
Yes. Somebody asked, can an employer discriminate on the basis of vaccinated and not vaccinated prospective employees when interviewing for a new employee? Well, of course, we've got the whole discrimination legislation piece in Victoria here, the Equal Opportunity Act. You can't treat someone unfavorably on the basis of a protected attribute. Being unvaccinated is not a protected attribute, but disability is, and if you have a medical contraindication, then that will fall within the definition of disability. Religious belief is a protected attribute. We're seeing a couple of employees resist vaccinations on the basis of religious belief, and political belief here in Victoria too is a protected attribute. So I think employers would need to be pretty careful in how they select or don't select candidates based on their vaccination status, because the directions that apply certainly don't give any protection in that particular area. So again, we're yet to see how this will this will play out in the broader scheme of things, but bound to happen in the near future, I would say. If I could pose this question to any of you or all of you, what is the actual death rate from COVID? Given that the answer to that question, we're told, is apparently very low, why are governments so panicked about this pandemic?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start on that, and others will have something to say, I'm sure. Look, the first is that you can answer that question in quite a lot of ways. So for us here in Victoria right now, the death rate over the pandemic period is in the order of 1.5%. So that's considerable. Okay? There's not too many easily transmissible conditions that can affect people at a range of stages of life that have quick progress to disease and no intervention that you can give after exposure to prevent disease occurring. And that's been the case for most of the pandemic. Some of those factors are starting to change at the moment. We are starting to get some post-exposure prophylaxis, but that combination of things, reasonably high mortality rate, can affect people who were previously well, rapid progression to disease, and not much you can do about it, I think probably tells a lot of the story, and uncertainty, probably tells a lot of the story there. I guess the other point that I would make is that mortality rate's really important, but it's not the only story here. If somebody's admitted to ICU and Paul does a fantastic job taking care of them, that still may have them in hospital for weeks, and it still may have long-term impact on their health. Whether or not we're talking about things like long COVID, simply the experience of being in hospital and the physical trauma that comes along with that these are things that have long ramifications. So the impact goes much beyond just the mortality statistics, but the mortality statistics are enough to also make us want to do a lot about it.
The mortality sounds low. For us as clinicians, 1.5 mortality is high. It's reasonably concerning. But the other number that's concerning is actually because of the replication rate. Delta infects on average, for every one person who gets infected, infects 8 other people. That's opposed to, and Justin could talk more about it, but that's as opposed to Ebola, which has a huge mortality rate, over 50%, but hardly ever spreads. It dies with the host. So we've got a highly spreading condition, which realistically, without vaccinations, without lockdowns, without any measures in place, is, and I don't think I'm overselling it, will likely infect the entire population. 1.5% of the Australian population is 375,000 deaths. I think that puts it into perspective a lot, because lay people will see that 1.5%, it's all right, I've got 99 chances to survive. But that's 375,000 deaths. So.
Puts it into perspective. Final question that I want to ask that's come through, because I think this is kind of common, and unfortunately there's so many good questions that we just can't get to all of them, but this is from an 18-year-old who has multiple friends that is scared of getting the vaccine due to their belief that they may struggle with fertility down the track. I wanted to pose possibly for Paul McGinn, can you comment on the belief that the vaccination can cause fertility issues?
Look, I'm happy, but I suspect Justin probably would give you a better answer than myself, but there is no scientific data whatsoever to suggest that. There was some studies done early that showed some of the vaccine components accumulated in the gonads, I think, but the doses that were given were massive. And so I'm not aware of any good scientific data, but again, Justin might have some better ideas on that.
Yeah, so agree that there's no concerns about fertility. The concerns about impact on fertility that are widespread, and so we really want to take them seriously. They've been taken seriously enough by the international community that there have now been a number of studies looking specifically at different aspects of this claim and providing very reassuring data for it. From me, I'd be interested to talk to this person and also to find out whether this is a male or female that we're talking about, because there are some different issues. And particularly when I'm talking to women of reproductive age around this, one of the really key things is that the impact of COVID infection during the time of pregnancy is huge. And so increased risk of miscarriage, increased risk of premature labor, increased risk of severe disease for mother and baby. So actually a very strong reason to be vaccinated in people who are thinking about fertility.
I think, yeah, exactly right. And this gained a lot more interest after Nicki Minaj and her tweet about swollen testicles, which I'd certainly say in my webinars is not one of the reliable sources of information I'd go to. The other thing, and this is just an added, is the studies initially precluded pregnant women in the studies, and that's just a standard response to phase trials. But since then, we've had hundreds of thousands of pregnant women included in the studies, and it's been found to be very safe in the first trimester, the second trimester, the third trimester. It's safe for breastfeeding. It's safe for the mother. It reduces your risk of those horrible COVID effects that can happen in pregnant women. And it's also safer for the baby because it helps reduce the risk of stillbirths, early premature labor, and distressed babies needing neonatal intensive care. So.
Thanks for that. Well, we have run out of time. So look, great discussion, everybody. Certainly the best forum that I've viewed in terms of the diversity of information, but I'll hand back over to Christine.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Dr. Paul McGinn, Professor Justin Denholm, and Dr. Christopher Edwards. We appreciate your time to share your insights and knowledge today. And thank you everyone for attending and asking those probing questions.